Hoi, lieve collega's. We'll be switching to English because of our guest of tonight, Mark Moore. Very honored and very happy that you are here with us in Utrecht to have a debate and a session on public value creation and your views on that topic. And we're very happy that you are all here to have that debate with us. And as an emergency situation speeds by, a quick outline on what we'll be doing tonight, and then I'll give the floor to Professor Moore, and then we'll wrap up this evening with a debate where you also get a chance to ask questions and to have some influence on what we're talking about. Mark Moore will be introducing his concept of public value and trying to translate that concept to also a little bit to our profession as consultants for the first half hour. So we'll have a talk of approximately 30 minutes by Professor Moore, and then we'll be seated here together, and we'll do a session of college tour, which I will try to moderate. And I will have some questions for Professor Moore, but there is a huge opportunity for you to formulate questions and to pose them and to see where that brings us. So I will be inviting you regularly during the session to formulate questions for Professor Moore, and we'll see where it brings us. Okay. One more practical thing: there is a guy with a camera. We're recording this session. First of all, for internal use, but we might also use bits of tonight for external use. So forget the camera, but keep in mind that it could be out there on the World Wide Web, as we all know it, just so you know it. All right? Any questions beforehand? Good. Professor Moore, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share with you some of the ideas that we've developed at the Kennedy School of Government over the last 40 or 50 years about managing for value in the public sector. And maybe I should just tell you a word about my background. I've been a professor at the Kennedy School since about 1974, so I've sort of grown up with the Kennedy School in its modern era. I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with Dutch public officials over the years due to my acquaintance with Theo and with Mark Vermeulen and with Kees Schmoen, and originally through Tilburg University, but now in this particular setting. And I'm mindful of the fact that this is a group of people who are consulting to the government. And that means that you don't quite have the weight and the burden of occupying the office and being the person who's going to be called to account for the work of the government and particularly its errors. But it does mean that you have the great privilege of being able to participate with the managers who are doing that work and share with them the burden of thinking about what government could do to create value for its citizens. And I have always had in the back of my mind that what I hoped to create in the world was a large army of people who I thought of as having restless public value-seeking imaginations. It occurred to me that one of the places where we might find many such might be in the consulting firms that are working with government, because in many respects you get invited to help with the most interesting and creative parts of government, which is when government's beginning to think about making a change or to figure out a new way to create public value, and they reach out for your methods and your knowledge and your goodwill to help them see their way through to that effort, and presumably you give your best to that particular job. So I feel like even though you're not exactly public managers, I'm in good company because you're people who are giving advice to public managers on the issues that would probably be the most interesting to me, as well as they probably are to you, which is making the important changes in government processes that could increase the value that they're creating. Now, in order to get that done, we can share together, I think, some ideas about how to think about the issue of public value and about how to size up particular ideas about whether they are promising enough to be pursued. And when I'm thinking about new public value ideas, I like to apply 3 different tests to them. And the first test I call the Giggle Test. And the Giggle Test is when somebody says to you what it is that they're planning to do, whether you can avoid laughing. All right. This may not sound like a very high standard, but by experience, a lot of things that come to me from the government, it's a little hard to resist laughing a little bit because there's so little reasoning behind it, so little argumentation and evidence that would cause a sensible investor, for example, to make an investment in that choice, that it's, it's a little bit, you sort of start and you sort of say, well, that needs a little work, let's go to work on it. And then you start going to work and then you discover that there really is an idea there and you have to see it more clearly and you didn't understand enough at the beginning. So that's test number one. Can you get past the Giggle Test? The second test is what I call the getting real test, which is, okay, I got the idea and I know what particularly we're planning to do to increase public value in what particular ways. Now the question is a realistic appraisal of whether there's any real chance in a particular context to see that particular idea realized and implemented. And that usually falls into two separate questions, which is one, do we really think this could be authorized and enthusiastically endorsed by the people that have to endorse the idea in order for it to go forward? And the second is it plausible that we actually have the operational capacity that would be required to deliver the results? And so the getting real test then becomes an investigation not only of the idea, but of the political and operational environment in which you're going to try to implement or have the idea adopted and implemented. And the last test in some ways is the hardest one, particularly for me as an academic, which is the getting off the dime test, all right? And in that particular moment, what's going on is, okay, I got the idea, I've tested it against the possibilities of the existing situation as best I can understand them. Now the question is, what do I need to do tomorrow and the day after that and next week and the next month in order to either test and adapt or actually realize the potential of the idea that we've come up with, all right? And that's where we go into not only action planning mode, but into actual action, and you begin trying to get your hands on the spigots that would release resources and the levers and catalysts that would generate new activity in the public sector organizations that you're trying to influence to create something of value. So the materials that we've constructed are essentially designed to support analyses of situations that would meet the Giggle Test, get past the getting real test, and lead into the getting off the dime test. So let me just quickly go to you're not going to get this full talk. We're going to skip by this one. And we're going to go directly to the strategic triangle. May I stand up? I feel like I'm, oh no, that'll screw up the photographs on it. Never mind. I'll lounge then.
Of course you can stand up.
I can stand up? Okay.
Just feels technical wonder, but I think I can manage it.
Okay. It turns out it doesn't matter a lot when I stand up. I'm only 5'2",
so you need this one?
I do need this, yeah. So, okay, so here we've got, so we'll start with this thing that we've worked on for a long time and taught for a long time called the strategic triangle. And what I want you to think about this is a guide for you to imagine value-creating opportunities in government. And it's a very simple idea. In fact, it's embarrassingly simple. It says in order for an idea to be worth doing by a public manager to whom you're giving advice, there has to be a public value idea, a public value proposition, an idea about how the world might be changed in some concrete material way that would improve the lives of individuals and the collective. And that's contained by this public value circle. Each of these circles represents a question that requires an answer. So what's the public value that you're proposing to produce here, all right? The second question is posed by the legitimacy and support circle. And if we were a business, this would be like the marketing part of the operation. The first part of the operation might be, do we have a new product that we think we can make money from? And then we'd have to think about whether there's a market within which we could sell it, all right? And in this particular case, if we're a public manager, we have an idea about a public value that we might be able to produce through some particular set of means. And then the question is well, are the people who are in a position to authorize us to take this action, and supply us with the resources we need to carry it out, enthusiastic about it, and will they support it? And will they support it with enough resources and over a long enough period of time to allow us to do the thing at the bottom there, which is build the operational capabilities that would be necessary to produce the desired value, all right? So it's a very simple idea. So simple, as I say, that it's a little bit embarrassing. All it really says is that something has to be valuable, authorizable, and doable, right? Now, most public managers don't get to high positions without having learned that particular idea. What turns out to be very hard, however, is to make sure that these different circles that you hit touch all the bases. And there's an extraordinarily difficult discipline associated with that. And this is where many things will fail the Giggle Test and or the getting real test. Because the Giggle Test will say, well, wait a minute, you're telling me that you can produce this change in the world with this new activity that we would be carrying out within the government, right? That's the proposed new value proposition. Do you really have strong evidence that that would be the case, or are you wishing that that would be true, all right? That's the Giggle Test. And it tests the relationship between your idea about how the operational capabilities need to be changed in order to produce the desired result. And then the getting real test is there going to be enough money and support and authorization for us to actually get this done? That's legitimacy and support. And the next test after that would be, and if we had the new resources, could we use those new resources to build the operational capabilities that we were currently lacking that would be necessary to produce the result? Is everyone clear about how this would work? So here's a slightly different, and the important thing, I think, go back here for a minute, is that this doesn't get decided in the abstract. I've represented it as the very abstract idea here, and it is that. Oh, let me, before I go there. Oh, no, okay. So what the interesting thing is that that strategic triangle has to be worked out in the context of a particular environmental context from a particular position. So it doesn't do you much good to say, let's go create public value, right? What becomes important is, what does it mean to create public value from this particular position in this particular context? And as soon as I start driving down to that level, the model gets very hungry for data, if you will, very hungry for particular information about the local situation, as well as for summing up and analysis and judging about whether things are possible. And the parts of the environment that you end up looking at are a piece that we call the social task environment, which is the social and individual and social conditions that are present in that environment that you feel some responsibility for changing. And your important job is to name the particular ways in which you hope that those conditions might be changed and give a justification about why that would be philosophically and politically valued. The second part is to look at the political authorizing environment, which is the source of a lot of legitimacy and support, and to ask the question, is there sufficient political demand and interest in pursuing this that we could actually get enough resources to get the job done? So I'm trying to imagine this public value proposition, a new public value proposition that would have an effect on the social task environment, drawing on resources in the political authorizing environment that would give you the legitimacy and support and the operational capacity necessary to go ahead in the context of where you, this figure here, is trying to act as an agent of the society, where our overall goal is to try to respond to the individual and collective aspirations for a good and just society. Now, as I say, that's a very abstract representation, but it reminds you that this only gets solved and is only interesting to get solved in concrete circumstances, all right? And what's hard in the concrete circumstances is to make sure that all of these different circles line up. So, what's important about that is that you have to get all three of these to line up or you're in deep trouble. So think for a minute about what happens if I have a valuable public value idea along with a means for getting it done, or an idea about how to get it done. And I have support for that, but it turns out that my idea about how to produce the value is wrong, or it won't work, or I don't have the capability to get it done. So I don't have the operational capacity to get the thing done. In that case, what happens? got value, got legitimacy and support, no operational capability. What happens? Fail, right? We call this in Texas the big hat, no cattle problem. Guy wandering around with a big hat and big buckle on his belt and can't get anything done, right? Can you imagine another situation where you have an attractive public value proposition and operational capabilities sufficient to produce that, but there's no longer any support for sustaining the activity? Then what happens? Out of business, right? So I was working with the Defense Department at the time that the Cold War ended, with the Soviets sort of giving up, all right? And when you interpret that in the light of the strategic triangle, one way to understand what happened was that a thing changed in the task environment, which was our principal enemy went away, right, or gave up the fight, all right? We built, on behalf of confronting that enemy, a very significant amount of operational capability. Eventually, the Congress of the United States noticed that Russia had gone away, all right? And then they looked down and they said, geez, I bet you we could take some money out of that huge defense establishment that we built and call it the peace dividend, and either give it to other activities or to give it back to the taxpayers, right? But from the point of view of the military, that was a disaster, because suddenly they were in a strategic context in which the value of their particular capability that they'd built had gone away, because the task environment had changed and because the politicians paying attention to that had decided that they no longer needed the capacity that was represented by the Defense Department as it was then configured. Okay. Another possibility is, can you imagine a public organization that has legitimacy and support and operational capabilities but isn't producing anything of public value? Have you ever seen a public organization like that? Some people say Harvard is that as well. As a loyal son of Harvard, I tend to want to dispute that idea. But I have to tell you that there's something about Harvard's environment that makes it very vulnerable to falling into that position, and it's this. In our authorizing environment, which is the place that we go to get legitimacy and support, is a group of people called dead donors. Harvard has a $30 billion endowment, right? And that $30 billion endowment produces money every year without us having to do anything, all right? Now, the important thing about dead donors is they're not very articulate about the public value that they want to see produced, all right? And even if they were articulate about it, they're not very determined to make it happen. They don't show up a lot to make sure that it happens, right? And as a consequence of that, all of the important judgments about public value are left to those of us in the operational capacity, and of course the most important people in the operational capacity are professors, thank you. And so, but don't worry, we have a theory about the public value we're there to produce. Would you like to know what that theory is? We're there to produce a small number of world-shaking ideas. Wait, I heard laughter. Where was the applause? Well, you're right to be a little skeptical about that as a mission statement, because we can't produce that over and over again. You know what I mean? There aren't that many ideas of that particular type, right? But don't worry. We have a theory about the conditions under which we're most likely to produce that result. That ought to be good enough, right? We've got a story about value creation, and you ought to believe the story. Would you like to hear what our story is?
High salaries for the professor.
That's it. But not just high salaries, also low teaching loads, small classes, frequent sabbaticals, lifetime tenure, walks on the beach. Everyone clear? Sounds like a recipe for producing value, right? And you can see how an organization like that, with a lot of resources and capabilities, might turn out to be nothing other than an organization that produced long walks on the beach. Everyone clear about that? Last possibility is that I have an idea about public value, and I have no legitimacy, or I have no legitimacy and support and no operational capabilities. All right? Now, if I'm in that position, strictly speaking, I'm an academic. And I've spent most of my life in that position, I have to tell you, all right, with a terrific idea about what would constitute public value, and nobody to support it, nobody to do anything about it, all right? Just me, standing out there in the air going blah, 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 all right? And it gets kind of lonely, and it's cold, there's a wind blowing, there's nobody else around. things don't seem to be happening. But I have to tell you, the more I have worked with public sector executives, and perhaps with those consulting to public sector executives as well, the more company I have found. All right? The reason is that there's something about being in those positions that makes us all vulnerable to this disease that goes something like the following. I'm such an attractive person, my ideas about public value are so attractive and compelling that it couldn't be true that there's not enough support and not enough capability to get the job done. All right? If I stand out here a little bit longer, make the case a little bit more clearly, with a little bit more evidence to get past the Giggle Test, if I find that key supporter in the authorizing environment, or we find an organization that might be able to develop some of the capability that we would need to carry this out, all right, everything will snap into place shortly. I just have to stay with it, right? Well, that's an academic perspective on public sector management. And what we think of a professional standard on public sector management would be, at any given time, I could walk up to a public manager and say, how you're doing? And that public manager would say something like, here's the public value I'm trying to produce. Here's where the support's going to come from. Here's where the operational capacity is going to be built and how it will operate, all right? And here are the steps I'm taking to accomplish that particular goal. And if you couldn't give that account, the question of whether you were fully occupying the position to which we had entrusted to you, would be up for grabs, all right? So this is a simple little diagram, but it turns out to be a rather stern discipline. And the number of things that fall off the rails sort of at the first effort to make sure that all of these bases have been touched is pretty high in my experience. And I think it's hard for both, I've done my own share of consulting to government, and it's hard for me sometimes to face up to the fact that an idea that I worked hard on ain't going to fly, right? And it requires a certain kind of realism that academics are not famous for, let me put it that way. So here's the big picture then, that we've got this idea of public value, which is a philosophical and practical idea. We're trying to work out the idea of public value along with an idea about how to increase that in the context of a political authorizing environment and the social task environment. And we're trying to make sure that we have, in the context in which we're operating, a reasonable chance to build the legitimacy and support and the operational capacity we need, and that both of those things together will actually change the social conditions that we're concerned about. Everyone clear about any questions at this stage? How much time do I have left? Should I stop or?
10 minutes.
Okay. Let me just take 2 steps further and dig a little bit deeper. I should tell you that this, I can explain this abstraction in about a half an hour, and most people get it. And many people look at it and say, well, yeah, that's sensible, and I can see how I'd use it. And what they mostly don't do is actually use the discipline of it, even at this level of analysis, all right? Because there is a stern discipline that goes with the idea, is it valuable? Is it supportable? Can you do it? Those are all actually hard tests to meet, not easy tests to meet, right? But then digging a little bit deeper, things get a little bit more complicated. And in the complication, there's hope for finding the thing that you're looking for, which is an opportunity to create value. But you have to do the work then of not only working with this level of abstraction, but digging deeper into the situation that you're currently in. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the idea of public value, which is one of the big ideas there, clearly. Now, I confess that when I came up with this idea of public value as the important goal of public sector managers, I was deliberately playing with an interesting feature of the word value, which is that it has 2 slightly different linguistic and political connotations, right? So that I can talk about value as a right-wing conservative idea that says what we need is more value for money, all right? We're interested in cash on the barrelhead. We're not going to put up with any bullshit stories about what's happening in the government. We want to see results, right? And we all know that that's so. Value, we're going to do value-oriented management, and that means numbers and accountability, and we're going to drive everybody to performance. Everyone knows that version of value, right? Then there's the other version of value, which is values. And it's sort of kumbaya. let's all do this stuff together that's so important and valuable, you know, and let's just hope that things work out okay, right? And that's a completely different meaning, obviously, from the first word, value, all right? And what's interesting, I think, is that you need both of these things when you're trying to construct and launch an important public value initiative. You need the kumbaya, right, to mobilize, to have a story behind a thing that will mobilize your political coalition. And you need the hard-nosed cash on the barrel head to be able to construct a measurement system that would allow you to not only sustain your political support by showing that you'd accomplished a particular result, but also to give you a chance to guide the operations of your own organization and to learn whether and how they're producing the result and whether you could get more of it. And I think that what happens in the world is that we have people that operate at one or the other of these levels, right? And not enough people who work across these levels. So if you've got a public values story and a cash on the barrel head story, you're in a very strong position to make an argument on behalf of public value creation than if you only had one of these. And conversely, if all you've got is cash on the barrel head, and people look at it and say there's nothing particularly inspirational about that, both in the political environment and in the employees that you're working with, then you can't get them on board and you can't essentially move forward. I should say that I take a certain amount of comfort in the fact that this is revealed, the importance of this was revealed to me a little bit in the commercial sector when I began thinking about what happened in the dot-com bubble. And as you know, what happened in the dot-com bubble, as well as what happened the other day when Uber took its, did its initial public offering. This is a firm that has made no money over the last 10 years, and it's valued at $32 billion, or $42 billion, or something like that. Now, how in the hell could that be true? This is an organization that doesn't have cash on the barrel head, right? It's got no, not only does it not have profits, it doesn't have revenues. And not only does it not have revenues, it doesn't even have a product yet. This was true for many of the things in the dot-com bubble. And yet it has a positive share price, all right? And even more amazingly, the share price goes up and down in response to something. Who the hell knows what it is, right? So what's going on there? What is it that people are valuing? These are presumably hard-nosed, cash-on-the-barrel-head business guys. What is it that they're valuing? They're valuing a story about the future. Who told them the story about the future? The guys that are the entrepreneurs, right? So the guys that are the entrepreneurs come up with a kumbaya story, all right? But then these are hard-nosed managers, so they want some hard facts to decide whether that story is doing well or not. And what do they demand then? This is important. They demand milestones that along the path toward progress that can be observed concretely in the world. So the thing that drives the stock price up or down is the degree to which the story they told about private value creation is actually being realized or in the world in which they're operating. Does that make sense to you? Now, there's nothing in the world that prevents public sector managers from telling a kumbaya value story and backing it up with some hard-nosed cash on the barrel head stories about what we would see in the real world if we thought we were advancing along that particular value path. Does that make sense to you? So there's a way of speaking both to the outside world and to the organization through being able to draw these two things together. Let me just go back here one more minute. Oops. Damn. Notice that if we have a good measurement system, one of the effects of having a good measurement system is that it not only gives an answer to each of these questions, but it also helps to support and sustain the group activity that would be carried on. So that if the question is what's the public value that we're trying to produce, the answer is given when I name the particular public value and describe the dimensions of value and tell people how they can observe and count whether that's happening in the world. So we get a clear definition of what counts as public value. When I do that, I also am likely to get a reasonable amount of support in the authorizing environment, particularly if I have tailored the particular dimensions of value that I'm talking about to the particular interests of the varied people that are part of the authorizing environment. Right? Understand? So imagine there are lots and lots of people in the authorizing environment who are interested in what we're doing in a particular public sector organization, all right? But they're all interested in a slightly different dimension of that, all right? Some people are really worried about keeping the costs low. Some other people are worried about keeping the quality of service to clients high. Some other people are worried about making sure that the effort is redistributive in its effects, in the sense that it brings up the poorer people rather than the richer people in some effort, all right? So they're focused on different dimensions of value. And if I've got a measurement system, a measurement that speaks to the concerns of each of those people in the authorizing environment, chances are they'll be supportive of me if for no other reason than the fact that I understand what their interest is. And I'm interested enough to begin sort of telling them how we're performing with respect to what they think their interest is, so that they can be reasonably sure that we're accountable and responsive to them. All right? So you can use the measurement system as a device for building and even organizing the legitimacy and support in the authorizing environment from individuals who are interested in our performance but value different aspects of our performance. They don't all have to agree on what the particular dimensions are. They just have to see their particular issue represented in the way in which we talk about our work. All right? And the last thing is that if I have an operational measure that goes down from la-la to hard-nosed facts, I can use the hard-nosed factual data to both animate and direct my organization, as well as to learn over the course of operating to see how we can improve, right? So a measurement system is actually crucial. A measurement system designed to be consistent with an existing strategic idea is absolutely crucial to the success of a development project. I understand that many of you working with government are working on collaborative arrangements in government. And as you've no doubt discovered, one of the difficulties in a collaborative arrangement with government is if you don't have a coherent central authority that can call everybody to task, right, you can't necessarily get a reliable performance from the collaboration, right? And what I often think about is that the only alternative to having a centrally, a honcho or a guy that has the authority over everybody else is to have a measurement system, well, to have first an agreement among peers about what it is that's important to do, what each of them is going to do in service of that collaboration, and then to have a tailor-made measurement system that makes sure that we can capture whether each of the members are living up to their responsibilities in that or not. So we use the idea of mutual accountability and measurement as an alternative to central authority to make the collaborations work. Does that make? So this is all meant to say having an idea about public value and being able to work your way through the measurement of it is critical to being able to manage these things. Again, that's just abstract advice, and all the work lies in doing that in a particular case, right? So this is, it's this.
Is your point of view that it must be possible, generally speaking, to measure public value?
Yes, that's my claim. And the way you do it is you first say it aloud to yourself. You say, I think the value that I'm trying to create is this. And as soon as you say that, you name the concept. Everybody wants to start with the statistics that are already present. I can show you 100 failures at government measurement that began with the available statistics, right? I would prefer to begin with the concept of what constitutes the value and then develop an operational measure that would allow me to observe it. And ideally, that operational measure would eventually allow me to count it as well. And maybe I could monetize it, but that's way down the pike and not the most important thing. The most important thing is to be able to say what it is that we're trying to produce and say it in a sufficiently clear and concrete way that we could imagine being able to observe it when it was happening. There's a book I wrote called Recognizing Public Value, and it has to do with essentially defining the problem of measurement as one of recognizing what's happening rather than simply, and then going from that to being able to measure it. But the first step is to say it and think about what it could possibly mean, all right? But there's, again, a lot of work there. Probably, all right, let me just show you two other quick things about this. If he gives me 2 minutes, he knows he's in dangerous ground. Maybe this is worth talking about as well, yeah. So let me do this. So there's this other interesting question. So one other way to talk about this is whether there's such a thing, could we construct an effective bottom line for a public agency, all right? And that is consistent with this hard-nosed idea, let's measure whether we're creating public value or not. And a famous police chief in New York City named William Bratton made a big hit with business people and with the New York citizens when he declared that, quote, reduced crime is the profit that NYPD earns for the citizens of New York City. And that he was determined to increase the profits of the New York City Police Department, and he would do that by reducing crime, all right? Now, do we have any accountants in the room? God, oh, no wonder you're suspicious about whether we can measure it or not. See, these guys are the enemy. Yeah, right, okay. So we begin with, so what's wrong with this statement? And notice that the bottom line in a commercial enterprise is profit equals revenues typically earned by sales, right, minus economic costs of production, all right? Now, in that phrase is where does reduced crime belong? Does it belong as a profit, which is what Bratton declares? Is it a revenue, or is it an economic cost of production? We know it's not an economic cost of production, right? Because this is something that we hope to get from the police department. So we think of it as a value, and it belongs on the value side of the ledger, okay? Is it profit, or is it revenue? Sorry? Revenue. A non-accountant got it. You have to give him a pat on the head, right? Now this. Lawyer. Oh well, there you go. Probably doing finance law or something like that, though, right? So what's interesting about it, of course, is that profit is the revenues minus the costs, right? And what's interesting is that when Bratton says reduce crime is the profit, he's confusing profit with revenues because he hasn't yet subtracted the costs. All right? Everyone clear about that? So that what you need to understand is that he has to subtract the costs of managing the police department as well as observe this benefit. Now, it turns out there are other problems with this formulation, which is what if it turns out that there are other dimensions of value that the police department is producing that aren't reflected here as revenues? Say, for example, about 90% of the calls that come into the New York City Police Department are for non-crime calls and for emergency services or care of one kind or another. Do you want to recognize the delivery of those services as an important dimension of value produced by the New York City Police Department? I certainly would, all right? There's no effort there to measure the impact that the police department is having on fear, all right, and the subjective consequences of fear in the city. Would you like to be able to measure that if you could? Yeah. There's no measure of the degree to which we are, as a matter of justice, calling offenders to account for their crimes, that is, clearing up crimes that have actually been committed. Would you be interested in that as a dimension of value? Essentially, how successful we are in calling offenders to account for their crimes. Would that be a dimension of value that you would care about? So all these different things are possible dimensions of value that could count as revenues in addition to reduced crime. Does that make sense to you? And then the big thing happens that when we come to the cost, what we're looking at is two different kinds of cost. Cost number one is the budgetary cost of managing the New York City Police Department. That's cost number one. And cost number two is the use of public authority to patrol the streets and arrest the people in New York City. Now, do you think we should think of authority as an asset that's available to public sector managers? That where we'd like to economize on its use. And if we were paying attention to a bottom line for government managers, then we would like to look at the value produced net of economic costs and net of the use of public authority. And when we use government dollars, what are we taking that away from? Private consumption, right? When we use authority, what are we taking away? Private liberty, right? And you could imagine that the public would value both of those things, right? So this is enough to make an accountant's hair turn gray, which would be we're going to start accounting for the level of use of public authority. What about that? Want to do that? Do you think it's important that a police department learn to use as little force as possible in the achievement of its goals that include reducing crime and calling offenders to account. All other things being equal, we'd like to produce that effect with the least intrusion into people's privacy, with the least restrictions on their liberty. That be an important feature? And this is really interesting because it turns out that nearly all public agencies use force and authority, the authority of the state, as part of what they're doing. Even when they're delivering services, the services often come with strings attached. So here's your drug treatment program, and we hope you enjoy it, but we also hope you give up your drug use, right? Here's your employment training, and we'll keep giving that to you, but we hope that you will find a job, all right? So often with our service delivery programs, there's a use of authority to motivate people to make the changes in their lives that we're hoping they might make, and we ideally hope that they might like it too, so they wouldn't find the burden terribly onerous. But if they don't, or if they do find it onerous, we're still going to ask them to make that effort on our behalf. I mean, that would be a particular way to look at it. And the other part that authority plays in social services is that we ration access to social services, all right? So that one of the things that's interesting that happens is as soon as we pass a public benefit, what's the first thing we do after that? We say we're going to give out this benefit. Then what's the next thing we say? Pardon me?
Regulations.
And the regulations are going to be about what?
The regulations for the service.
The regulations and service delivery things are going to be who's eligible for that and how much benefit they're going to get, right? Now, that's completely different than trying to satisfy them as customers, right? What we're doing is saying, you have access to this particular benefit, but we're going to ration access to it. And in that moment is a judgment about what? How would we decide that some people were entitled to a benefit and others weren't? Either an economic rationale that sort of said these are the people who could make the best use of the benefit, right? That would be one principle.
Or political rationale.
Well, political could be, I want to use the word political to refer to all dimensions of public value, right? It's not that some dimensions of public value are political and others aren't, right? The things that become important dimensions of value are the dimensions that are politically important, right? That's what it means to connect up the idea of public value with the political operation, all right? So everything in this model is political in the sense that it is taking advantage of commonly shared ideas about what would be a good thing for us to do together. They're all political in that sense, all right? And we're trying to then find, and one of the things that they might be interested in is we think some people are more deserving of this benefit than others, right? So that's a concept of justice that's on the other, just like some people deserve to get arrested, some people deserve a benefit, right? So there's a concept of justice there. So one of the interesting things that's associated with many of our judgments about public value then has to do with the fact that we're always end up using two different philosophical standards for deciding whether something is good or bad. And one of them is a utilitarian standard that's concerned with the good, where the basic principle is the greatest good for the greatest number. And the other is a different philosophical system called the deontological system, where we're concerned about the just and the fair. And these different systems, because authority of the state is always being engaged, the deontological system becomes an important part of our evaluation, as well as the utilitarian. And then, equally important, is the fact that we can observe these effects happening at different levels. So that, many of you might say, well, the most direct way to measure public value would be to check whether the individual clients to whom we delivered benefits liked it or not, customer satisfaction, right? But that's hardly ever our only objective, right? We're often trying to accomplish something more than that with clients, right? And the something more that we're trying to accomplish with clients often has to do with our ability to achieve the aggregate social results. So that we service you as a client, and then what we hope is that service repeated once, again, 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 and with this one added, all right, will gradually have an effect on you that will elevate your status and keep you on a plane going forward. And that's the individual level social outcome. And you could want that or not, right? It's something that we have decided would be good for you, and if you join our program, you sign up to that, right? And you can imagine that that gradually accumulates not only within individuals, but across individuals to achieve an aggregate social state that's different than the one that we started with, right? And that's all on the utilitarian side. So this is the world of program evaluation, if you will, and benefit cost analysis to some extent. This other world over here on the right is a world where we look at two different levels again, but from the point of view of justice and fairness rather than utilitarian concerns. And at the individual level, we ask the question, did people get what they were entitled to, whether that was a benefit or an obligation, right? And then we also look at the question of whether we were respectful in our treatment of those people, right? But at the aggregate level, we're often interested in the question about whether our respectful and satisfying treatment of individuals not only helped us to achieve desired social outcomes, but also helped us advance to a larger outcome that was a good and just society, as well as simply a prosperous society. Does that make sense to you? So you could imagine that the first step in constructing a public value account for a public organization in a particular context would be to try to fill these things out. And in some ways, this is what a public value account might look like, where we'd be paying the publicly costly assets that we were being used, and we'd check about the dollars and the public authority. And then we'd look at the impact that was being produced in terms of mission accomplishment, social outcomes, and client satisfaction, and also then the degree to which individual rights were vindicated, obligations were justly imposed, and justice and right relationships were being produced as a consequence of our effort. All right? So just imagine taking that and casting it, trying to spread across that framework a variety of effects that would be associated with any of the particular organizations that you'd be dealing with, and you would have put in the hands of their managers an ability to both talk politically about what it is that they're doing, philosophically about what it is that they're doing, and operationally about how they could accomplish the desired results. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I can lounge.
Now you can lounge. You've earned it. And he's been like this the whole day. Let's see how this works.
You need more accountants. Not social scientists. Don't bother with them. Just get accountants. Accountants is what you need.
I'm feeling less appreciated with every session that we have because he keeps repeating this. Good.
About that.
Yep.
Seize your opportunity, Martin.
You're entitled to a defense.
You told us about what William Breton says.
Yeah.
I must say, what he says, less crime, easier to count than the things you mention here, public authority and reduction of fear. So
yeah.
I guess that's the reason why he chose to simplify things so that you can understand it by saying let's count the reduction of crime.
No, I think he wanted to draw attention away from the costs of producing the results he was producing, which were not necessarily higher budgetary costs, but dramatically increased uses of public authority, right? Which he didn't want to, because we didn't have a very good accounting system for capturing that, we couldn't see that what was happening was that the total number of arrests for misdemeanor offenses was doubling in this period of time, okay? And it was irritating the black community, okay? So, you know, if you were asking the question, I think it was a deliberate misleading effort because he was using an unmonitored asset, increasing the use of a unmonitored costly asset to produce a result that he couldn't get with just money. And he was unaccountable for that.
A nightmare for accountants.
It's not, it's actually not.
No, Mark, no.
We solved that problem. We know how to solve that problem.
What I'd like to do is address three major topics for the coming hour, maybe hour and 10 minutes. I'd like to talk a bit about your career and how you ended up here in Utrecht, speaking to us with so much passion about your ideas. Of course, I'd like to discuss your model and the applicability of your model a little bit further. And I thought to ask you for some reflections on current affairs, not in the least part, which is happening in your own country with your president. From a public value perspective, I think that would be an interesting way to wrap up today. Let's start with that. No, let's start with the others. Let's start with the others, because else we won't get there.
My career is much more interesting.
I wouldn't ignore that either, but
There's got to be some payoff for.
For 45 years
exactly,
professorship. What I'd like to do is I have 2 or 3 questions on each theme for you, and then of course you get a chance to also address Professor Moore with questions, and of course you will neatly stick to the themes that I've just outlined. But if you get a little creative, that might also be okay. And I think Pepijn has a microphone, so if you just raise your hand if you want to ask a question after I say you can, then and then it will all go very smoothly. Mark, I had the pleasure of picking you up yesterday from the airport of Roeland, and we were in the car, and it was only 5 minutes, and you were already talking about the political system here in the Netherlands and whether we have structures or processes that are dominant in how we achieve public value. Are you always on? Is this your...
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yes?
Much to my wife's displeasure.
Yes. And you've been for 45 years?
Yes.
How did that start? Because you mentioned earlier a disease that...
So I was graduating from college from Yale in 1969 in the United States, and I had all my life expected that I would go into government. It was a very politically active time and stuff like that, and so I was planning to go to law school, since it seemed to me that what most people did when they wanted to work in government was they went to law school so they would have an alternative career, so they didn't have to stay in the government if they felt compromised by it in some way. And so I was headed for the either the Yale or the Harvard Law School, and I would have been in Bill Clinton's class, actually, if I'd gone to the Yale Law School. But in that year, in 1969, they invented this new program at the Kennedy School that was called the Public Policy Program. And what that program advertised was a newly created program by some very distinguished faculty members that would allow students to learn analytic techniques that would allow them to see clearly what things the government could do to make the world better. Sound familiar? So since I was always planning to go into government, and I wasn't all that sure about law school, and this was a brand new program, I signed up for it somewhat enthusiastically. And I got there, and I was completely intrigued by the public policy program, and as I say, this prospect for being able to use analytic techniques to peer into a complicated world and discern within it the set of things that would be worth doing and what would actually work to accomplish a particular result. So I was a student of benefit cost analysis and program evaluation and systems analysis and statistics and operations research and a little bit of management, a little bit of politics, a little bit of philosophy, not very much. And I got to the end of that year, and the choice was whether to go to law school or stay at the Kennedy School and get a PhD. And I stayed at the Kennedy School to get a PhD because I suddenly realized there was no kind of lawyer I wanted to be in the periods in which I wasn't working for the government. And what I would have preferred to be then was a teacher, professor. And the Kennedy School was just getting started, and it looked like a going concern. And so I said, I think I'll stay and get a PhD. So I did that. And I should maybe tell you the story. Well, no, it's too long, so I won't bother to tell you that. So, but in any case...
Self-restraint.
Yeah, barely. So I was then appointed to the faculty and began teaching in the program sort of 2 years after I joined it. I went to the Drug Enforcement Administration and had what I think could be described as a searing experience in government. Drug Enforcement Agency... Because
you left academics and started working for government.
For government. We were, at that stage, it was unusual that young academics at the Kennedy School were encouraged to go off to the government to take a job to get some experience. And so I went off to this job, and the basic internal management techniques of DEA were all the techniques we learned on the street. So we extorted one another, we lied to one another, we assassinated one another's character. It was an absolutely
Very friendly environment.
It was absolutely terrifying, this environment, I have to tell you. And I think my career nearly ended about 3 times there with various plots hatched against me. The way I described it later is I spent 2 years walking into rooms where nobody wanted to see me, all right, and sort of sticking my jaw out and staying there and trying to get it done. So I then went back to academia, having discovered that I might not quite have the temperament that it took to be a good public manager, which was a much more even-tempered and resilient person than I actually was. And I said, okay, so I'll go back to the Kennedy School and I'll give myself a career trying to make the Kennedy School a great institution. And so, and I thought the nice thing about that is when I got to be 65 or 70, I'd know whether I succeeded or not. And it was a fairly straightforward run, and so I signed up for that. Yeah. And then I spent the next 45 years working for the Kennedy School. So.
Yeah. And in the car driving here, you said to me, reflecting on my career has become fun since the past 2 or 3 years. Yeah. Because you've achieved...
I'm not quite as mad at the Kennedy School as I used to be. And the thing that made me mad about it was that we kept drifting away from our mission, which was to essentially enable public leaders and managers to do their jobs better and to come up with important policy ideas. And we seem to be retreating over and over again to being a multidiscipline-based academic enterprise where nobody was particularly interested in the professional impact of our work. Yeah. I should mention that the particular assignment that I got then as a 28-year-old was that the dean of the Kennedy School said to me, I said, look, we know we're going to eventually start training people other than policy analysts. We're going to train leaders and managers as well as policy analysts. And we have to have something to teach them. And then he said, I don't think the schools of public administration are the schools that we want to emulate when we're teaching about public management. So I want you to go and create a different field that might be called public management or even strategic public management, and see whether you can establish that as a competitor to schools of public administration, drawing on the aspects from the public policy program that had to do with concerns about value and concerns and where we were going to try to integrate politics and value and analytics together in management, right? So I was then dispatched to the business school to learn what they knew about strategic management of organizations and to do what I could do to adapt those ideas to the public sector. So I got that assignment and went to work on it. And
it passed the Giggle Test for you at that time,
boy,
a 28-year-old.
Yeah, right. So I thought, well, what the hell, might as well give it a shot. So that's what I did.
And it worked out nicely.
From my point of view, I couldn't have had a better career. I just wish the institution had stayed truer to its aspirations, and we just kind of. If you want, I can do a terrific strategic triangle analysis of the Kennedy School.
Actually, maybe at the drinks.
No, this takes 2 minutes. It turns out that the Kennedy School can never be a great professional school because our personnel system doesn't produce the faculty that we need to do our work. It's as straightforward as that.
20 seconds.
Yep.
One last question from my side on your career is I did some math and the book, your first book, Creating Public Value, appeared in 1994, 1995, and I think you were about 45.
I guess. Yeah.
Has the appearance of the book been a milestone in your career and a change in your career? Is it different after the book?
Well, it was different. No, not so much. I mean, it was different in the sense that it was nice to have the book out and people began picking it up. But it had a slow evolution. It sort of, it was at the time of the new public management. And so I was attacking the new public management and I was attacking public administration at the same time, showing my usual good strategic sense. So there wasn't exactly an audience for the book. But where they began to find an audience was actually in our executive programs. And since the book emerged out of our executive programs as well as in service to our executive programs, my life didn't change that much at that particular time. It did, I suppose, it's fair to say my first appointment at the Kennedy School was in criminal justice. And so this then shifted me a little bit more in the public management direction. And then I became the head of the nonprofit center. And more irrevocably then in the business of thinking about the management of public institutions of one kind or the other. But no, I wouldn't say it changed my career that much.
Okay. Hands for questions. Ah.
Mark,
I should say it was a pretty unique opportunity that I had. So, yeah.
What is the best public problem you solved?
I think the thing I'm proudest about is work we did on the idea of community policing. It was part of both my criminal justice work and my public management work. And there's a lot to be said about it, but the thing that was interesting to me about it was that we could develop an idea about how to police cities that looked very different from the standard model of policing. And it focused much more attention on engaging with communities in the effort to create legitimacy and support, and to for at least two reasons. One is that often delivering those services were valuable in themselves, and in addition they built a different relationship with the community that allowed the crime-solving aspects of the police and the crime-reducing aspects of the police to do better. And over a period of time, and I figured out a method that would allow us to get that idea of community policing developed and diffused broadly through the police community. And that itself was an interesting invention for the Kennedy School. We developed this thing that I called an executive session, which was we took 15 of the leading police executives in the country, and they agreed to come to the Kennedy School and meet about 3 times a year for 4 years. All right? And in that period of time, we gave ourselves the task of coming up with a better model of urban policing in the United States. And what was really interesting about it was that the police field was already in motion on this, right? And I don't think it would have worked but for that. So it was so we were learning with the police executives rather than doing research and teaching them, all right? And what gradually happened was that, and it was bipartisan, we had Ed Meese, who was Reagan's Attorney General, and Susan Estridge, who is Michael Dukakis's campaign chairman, in this group, all right, along with both progressive and retrogressive police chiefs. And we just started developing the idea and beating the drums for it. And I think it's a very good idea about how to police, and gradually made headway unexpectedly against the considerable forces that were arrayed against it at the time. So I think I'm most proud about that particular thing. But there are other less significant achievements along the way as well.
Have you solved many public problems?
Many, yes. No. Can't you see the evidence of that in America?
Mark, you're trying to skip to the last topic. No, but it's a serious question because, of course, you've done a lot of thinking about how to solve public problems. But you said your first ambition or the starting point was that you actually wanted to solve them yourself, that you wanted to contribute.
Yeah. Well, I think that I liked the idea of contributing ideas to the public sphere, and I did that both in the substantive field of criminal justice and in the field of nonprofits and their contributions to larger societies and public policies toward the nonprofits. But I think my major contribution was through the development of the concepts of public management and the teaching in our executive programs. If you asked me what I was proudest of over the long run, I think it would be the now probably tens of thousands of students that have passed through our executive program and commented on and used the concept. For the first maybe 5 to 10, I didn't tell you the story. I did tell you? No, I didn't tell you the story.
I don't know which story you're...
Yeah. When you get old, you get a little fuzzy and you can't remember when you told the stories. About the first time I taught in a Kennedy School executive education program, I was a 27-year-old associate professor, and sitting right about where you were in the program was General George Patton Jr. And I think my subject for the day was leadership. And as you can imagine, the Kennedy School and Harvard in general is a very friendly, cooperative place, and where we all understand that we have to do a lot to help one another and stuff like that.
It sounds like Berenschot.
Yeah, exactly. And so just before I got up to give this talk on leadership to General George Patton Jr., I got a note from one of my senior colleagues who had had a distinguished public career at that time and went on to become the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, so a very accomplished man. And he wrote me a note and he said, Mark, he said, I've calculated that there's over 2,000 years of government experience represented in this room. I'm sure that they're dying to hear what your 2 years of pathetic failure have to offer. I was about 6'2" when I started teaching in executive education, but the fact of the matter was that was an incredibly important intellectual experience, because the way we were teaching was through cases. And so we'd develop cases that were real examples of people facing problems, and then we'd hear the executives discuss it, right? And then we'd get together among ourselves and the faculty, and we'd say, what do we think we learned from this case and the discussion we just heard? And essentially it was the set of ideas that emerged from that got written down in the books that I've created. So it was a real effort in communal learning. So it's only an accident that my name appears on the book.
Other questions?
So good teaching is getting good cases.
No, Martin, we have rules. I'm now using my public authority.
Yeah, I have a question. Which country is the best in creating public value? And what do you think we can learn from that?
Geez, I don't know. Actually, it's interesting. There have been about maybe 6 or 7 governments of either countries or states, all right, that have made pretty substantial commitments to the idea of using the concepts of public value to try to improve the performance in their public sector, right? And like many sort of political initiatives in managerial reform in the public sector, they produced a mixed success. I remember one of the areas, the Premier of South Australia committed his whole state-level government to using public value as a way to do their public budgeting, their operational decisions, their management control systems and stuff like that. It wasn't even clear what it meant to commit a whole government to this particular way of thinking, because it's really advice to individuals about how to do their jobs rather than an advice about an organizational system that will cause individuals to think and act that way. But nonetheless, we did. And I remember I came to see him about 2 years into this at one stage, and he said, you let me down. You let me down. And I said, oh, gee, well, how did I do that? And he said, well, my guys failed to spot a big political shitstorm that happened with a child abuse and neglect case. And I sort of listened to that for a minute, and I said, well, and this, I said, there's no intellectual system that's going to guarantee results. It's always the question about whether the people that are doing the work understand and use and improve the system that they're operating with. I can't give you any guarantees that you install this in your government and suddenly things are working better, all right? What I can give you is an account that sort of says, if you had a lot of people thinking like this, do you think that on average the level of government performance would go up? And is there anything we're doing right at the moment that is preventing people from thinking and acting like this, right? And so I don't, it would be hard for, it's a little bit like community policing. I did a national evaluation of whether community policing was successful or not, right? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer, at least in the first instance, because it would be hard to say to what degree any particular police department had actually adjusted their operations in a way that was completely consistent with the model of community policing, all right? So I think this picture that we have that that we develop these innovations and then we can go and evaluate whether they work or not is a little bit uncertain, at least in part because the thing that's being evaluated is itself not quite distinct enough to be held firm in a program evaluation or a randomized controlled trial kind of a way. Does that make sense to you? Okay.
So unfortunately, there's nothing to learn.
That's right.
Other questions? Here in the front?
If there's something, well, yeah.
Once
He just trashed my entire life, but apart from that.
about learning, you wrote an article about what can businesses learn from
Yeah, I like
private
that one.
manager.
Yeah.
Yes. There's an entrepreneur president in America. What can he learn from public managers? Or about creating public value?
This idea that Trump was either a good negotiator or a good manager, I cannot understand how that idea has lasted anywhere. I don't.
You wrote a book?
Pardon me?
You wrote a book on it?
No, he didn't write the book. He had some ghostwriter write the book, all right? And no, I mean, he's a complete and utter fraud. I mean, I don't think he has, I think most of the money he has came from his father, and that he lost a huge amount of money as a businessman. If he made money as a businessman, it was through deal making rather than through building a organization that was capable of inventing and creating new services and products and doing that in a collective way. I mean, the idea that he's a manager, anybody that anybody would want to emulate as a commercial leader strikes me as incredibly stupid. I don't think the business community in the United States thinks much of him. They just like the fact that he gave them tax reductions. That would be my view.
Is creating public value enough?
No, I don't think. I think he's destroyed public value every place he's gone, I think he's. I keep writing this to myself so that I can get to sleep at night. I keep writing down all the ways in which he has not made America great again. All right. So I write down alienated from our most important international allies. Right. Curried favor with foreign despots. All right. This is all before obstructed justice and evaded the oversight of Congress and undermined the constitutional order of the United States. Was a revolting human being. I mean, it's just, you know, exactly where is it that we can see in this evidence of making America great again? And what I genuinely don't understand, and if I do understand it, it makes me very sad, is why his base doesn't turn on him. I just don't understand it. And the only way I can understand it is that the group that he's appealing to felt so badly diminished and insulted and ignored over a long period of time that they're perfectly happy to have anybody attack the people that they think did them wrong. That's the only way I can understand it. And they'll take losses, economic losses and social losses and stuff like that, to keep a guy in the office who, despite his horrible character and his horrible record, will keep sticking his finger in the eyes of the people he regards as the elites.
The enemy of the enemy is my friend.
Very sad state of affairs. And I think America has to look at itself in the mirror in a lot of ways. But man, it's so interesting. You look over the last 40 years, and there was a social revolution that was taking place in America with respect to equality for blacks, equality for women, for transsexual and homosexual people, and generally an effort, to bring the bottom up. And the way that some of the most intelligent political anthropologists who have written about this analyze the circumstances. One woman, I'm trying to remember her name, she describes it as the particular group of white rural people feeling that somebody had cut in line. They'd been waiting a long time to rise up in the American system, right? And then just when they thought they were about to get there, this movement sprung up and suddenly pushed a lot of other people ahead of them in line. And they're just pissed off about it. And I can understand that, and that would make, nobody pushed in front of me in line, but if I'd been further down in the social status, a lot of people might have pushed beyond me who I didn't think would necessarily deserve what they got. So just as a quick side on this, I made this discussion about the use of public authority bringing in concerns about justice, as a reason to bring back into our vocabulary about public value language that's concerned with fairness and justice and stuff like that. But the issues of justice and right relationships are in the society all the time. And they're the underbelly of an awful lot of political issues that turn out to be the most intractable ones, right? So can I illustrate this with an idea? So I remember when the AIDS epidemic broke out in the United States, and as I began to try to think about that and analyze it, it suddenly occurred to me that what had happened was that a new category of person had showed up in our society. This category hadn't existed before then, and the category was a person who was HIV positive, right? And the interesting question was, well, now we have this new person in the society, and it's not their complete identity, it's just one part of their identity. But to the degree that they have that identity, what rights and responsibilities attach to that new status in the society, right? So if you can imagine, society is consisting of a lot of little offices that you could occupy, and the offices, and each of them involves certain rights that you have and certain responsibilities and a corresponding status in the society, high, low, blah, blah, blah. So predictably, the left comes out and says, well, HIV victims have special rights. And the special rights were that, A, they should be protected against discrimination, which was likely to occur, which seemed right. And B, they have a right to have accelerated research on the illness and how it might best be treated, because all other things being equal, we'd like to save their lives, right? And both of those seemed like perfectly sensible value judgments, but they were based on an idea about what this new category of person was entitled to as a matter of justice or right relationships or something like that. And then the right comes screaming out of the woods and says, well, but they have obligations as well. And the obligations are to find out whether they have the disease or not, and to take actions that might restrain them from spreading the disease, right? And that we ought to think that that was an important part of the responsibility as well, right? So you got the left and right squaring off and having a big political tussle about this and stuff. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, they're both right. Everything that people were saying was true, that there was this new category and probably had some new rights associated with it and had some new obligations that were associated with it as well. And that we probably weren't going to solve the problem until we figured it out that this was an issue in how we thought about the right relationships between us and people with HIV/AIDS, right? Does that make sense to you? And I think the same thing is happening now with respect to immigration. I don't think we're going to solve the immigration problem until we figure out exactly what it is that each society thinks they owe to people who come to their borders, either for economic advance or for refuge, right? And that's going to be decided as a matter of justice, I think, more than it's going to be decided as a matter of, what's in the economic interest of the country. And so part of the reason then for nominating this concern about justice and right relationships is to say that in the underbelly of most of the issues that we're concerned about is an argument about what we owe to one another, as well as what we can produce for one another or the way in which we can make one's lives materially better. And until we get good at having that conversation with one another, a lot of our most important problems are not going to get solved.
And is there a perspective on getting better at that? Because you earlier mentioned that you don't
Yeah,
really understand the support base for Trump.
Yeah, I don't. My colleague, Ronnie Heifetz, has done a lot of work on an area that he calls adaptive leadership, which has to do with trying to help people come to grips with a loss that they don't want to take, right? And a lot of these relationship issues have to do with, I think, people learning how to take losses to statuses that they once enjoyed and occupied and stuff. And it's a lot related to the stages of grief idea, that you first do denial and then you do negotiation, but there's something about having to stay with the experience of loss long enough that you can get past it, right? And recognizing that there's a loss there that needs to be taken. And there's something about that. And then there's another line of thought that I'm sort of more hopeful about and think is more generally applicable, which is having public managers in particular get much better at the facilitation of public deliberation around public value issues and how government's assets should be used. I think that for a long time we've depended on electoral politics to legitimate government action, all right? And I think electoral politics was always a little bit of a weak strand for legitimating all of government action because the elections weren't about all issues, and they couldn't then legitimate all the choices that were made. And if anything, that has grown because the number of issues that are being decided by government everywhere across the country is now huge. And the idea that all of that mass of stuff that you're consulting about and advising about and stuff is going to be legitimated by elections strikes me as very odd, right? I just don't think the elections will reach that far or that deep or be that decisive with respect to legitimating that. And then we could say, well, then what we can do is rely on the expertise that we have to substitute to build legitimacy that we can no longer get from elections. But I don't think expertise is a strong enough legitimating factor either. And I think the only way to recover the public in the discussion of public value is to learn how to effectively engage the public more widely in deliberations about what they would like to use with the collectively owned assets of government, right? And so I call that calling publics into existence. There was a great phrase by the philosopher John Dewey that said in a book called The Public and Its Problems, which is a terrible book until the end. So if you get it, just go to the end. But what he basically said was that an important role for public executives and leaders in democratic systems is to call a public into existence that can understand and act on its own interests. All right? Now, I find a lot really interesting about that. And the first idea is that a public doesn't exist automatically. You have to call it into existence, right? Then you think, well, that's interesting. When is it that, because in a liberal society, we all want to live most of our lives in private. We don't want to be in public all the time. But we need a public every now and then to decide what it is that we're going to publicly value and try to produce. So how do we call that public into existence? Well, one way is an election, right? But then there are a whole lot of other ways of doing that. Administrative hearings, consultations of various kinds, deliberative polling done by political scientists. There are a very large number of ways of engaging the public in a discussion about what they think is publicly valuable to do that I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface of and understand. Can I give you one hopeful note on this? One of my colleagues from the Kennedy School sensibly got tired of being an academic and went back to do something important. And he went back to his home state in Idaho, and he wrote a letter to about 100,000 people in Idaho and said, if you're as disappointed in democratic government as I am, I hope you will join my organization. And the price of joining my organization is that you have to spend a week of your time working on an issue in which you have no interest whatsoever. Now, this was really incredibly interesting, right? Because our standard model of what democratic processes is we listen to all the people who have an interest or who have a stake, right? And here he was trying to convene a group of people who were not uninterested, because if they signed up, they demonstrated an interest, but disinterested in this particular subject, right? And that just seemed like an incredibly interesting idea to me. And it turned out that so they'd get the group together and they would make sure it was represented equally by Democrats and Republicans, and they'd do the analysis of the issue at hand, right? So this was kind of a lay or public expertise that was constructed through this commitment to study the issue from a disinterested perspective. And amazingly enough, they won in their first two legislative outings against entrenched private interests in the state of Idaho, right? So he calls this common purpose, I think, is his name of the group. And so we've been working with him to try to think about how to spread this model more generally. But when you think about it, it's a lot like what we do with juries, right? Where we don't want people who are interested in the judgment in a jury. We want people who are disinterested. And then we construct an elaborate format around them so that they are instructed as to how to analyze the situation from a, quote, disinterested point of view, all right? Well, gee, why don't we do that for a lot of things in the public sector? And every time we have a tough issue, instead of running a campaign of some kind where all the factions show up, right? Run a process where we can get past the factions to hear what a group of disinterested citizens might say about the public policy issue at hand. Anyway.
Is in the end the determination of what is public, what public value is, always subjective?
Yes. Well, it's subjective and collective.
Okay.
See, that's the thing that's so interesting, is that a lot of people say, well, it's, but the definition of economic value is always subjective. And that's individually subjective. You know, I value this wristwatch enough to buy it. That's a subjective decision that becomes objective when I plunk the money down to buy it, right? But whether I think it's right or wrong for Trump to be president, all right, is a subjective judgment, but it's a judgment that might be shared or not by large numbers of other people. And it seems to me that an awful lot of the challenge of building a concept of public value is to have individual subjective values about what's good and what's just to become more widely shared, and to have that more widely shared perception be based on some reflections and facts and arguments such that we can have the public judgment that we need about what constitutes public value. There's another great book written by a pollster who was famous principally for his commercial stuff, but he wrote a wonderful book called Coming to Public Judgment. And in that book he describes how a public confronted with an issue over a long period of time learns to think about it and decide about it, right? And starts off confused, but then gradually works toward a consensus. Now, it's not always the consensus that you like, and one of the cases he studied, at a particular moment in U.S. history, the public had clearly arrived at a consensus that capital punishment was okay, right? Well, I don't like that, right? No. But it was, you had to respect it if you're a strong Democrat and sort of say, if we want the public's views about what's right and wrong and good and bad to prevail, if they've had a chance to look at the issue and think about it and are reasonably well informed and they've come to that judgment, that deserves some respect,
Yeah. So in that sense, what Trump is doing is creating some kind of public value.
He's certainly nominating a set of ideas about what constitutes public value, and he's getting a large political chorus back that would back him. But if you wanted to see a really, really terrible public value discussion, it was over the question of the border wall. I mean, I don't know whether any of you
in
heard
itself
this or
a very interesting concept.
Oh, I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, it was, were you in favor of the wall or were you against the wall? All right? And there was no discussion of what the problem was for which the wall was the answer, why anybody thought the wall was an appropriate solution to that. Did we really mean a wall? I mean, we had this ridiculous conversation about, well, if we have concrete slats, does it? And it was all just for, there was no analytic or empirical content to the discussion at all. And so, that kind of discussion, I don't think you have to have a lot of respect for, because I think people's qualified opinions matter. But what qualifies an opinion is a little bit of openness to the competing values at stake, a little bit of taste for empirical evidence about the state of the problem and what might be done to solve it, and a little bit of reflection on how that all should balance out. And that qualifies an opinion then to count as a citizen's opinion, it seems to me. Not any opinion is a citizen's opinion, and what we ought to be interested in is developing citizens' opinions. I did a session today with the art, culture, and broadcasting people, right? And one interesting way to think about their public value proposition for the Netherlands is that they're actually out there trying to construct a public that is inclined toward the use of facts and the commitment to kind of open-mindedness and tolerance and stuff, rather than asserting yourself and expressing yourself in ways that feel good to you but are disrespectful to others and disrespectful of the truth.
Arts and culture as a means of making citizens.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Question. Hank.
Yes, I wanted to ask what you would say if President Trump came with an announcement. He had read your book, Creating Public Value, and he would say, well, I'm making public value, but we already talked about that.
Yeah, right.
But in fact, you are saying we need some other things for speaking of public value.
Right.
For example, interaction, quality of debate.
Right.
Doesn't it mean that you have a force around? Yes, a force of quality, interaction, etc.
Right. Yeah, the thing is, this is really an interesting question, right? Because if you try to do that through the use of public authority in the United States, you run up against the First Amendment, right? And freedom of speech, and the stern injunction that the public will make no laws that will interfere with the freedom of speech, right? And if you have that First Amendment standing there, then you don't have any real mechanism for trying to discern the quality of what constitutes good speech versus bad speech, right? In the public square, if you will, right?
Only maybe social capital, or
Well, so then you have to solve the problem not through a structure or a law, but through a roots up kind of process, where you rediscover what it means to have a civil conversation with one another, and what it means to have a factual conversation with one another, right? And you depend on instruments like education and churches and stuff like that to try to teach these important principles of citizenship in a democratic society, right? And it's hard to coerce people into being good citizens, all right? Boy, if you if you've got it, don't ever lose that, because if you lose it, getting it back is going to be hellish for us. I mean, I'm actually afraid of violence in the United States. I never thought I'd be in a position to say that.
so actually the quality that Henk is talking about, or the power that Henk is talking about, is decreasing instead of increasing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then he's hoping for a structural remedy to that. And I think a structural remedy will get you part of the way, but I think it's going to be a lot more process inventions, right? And which is part of the reason why I'm saying that the administrators in the public square have got to find ways to reinforce citizenship by engaging people in the process of popular government. A good way to think of, here's another way to think about it, is that the American Revolution, I love this idea. This comes from my nonprofit days. It turns out that I went to South Africa, and I realized when I was there that the South Africa Constitution and government had systematically suppressed any kind of collective action, informal collective action, all right? So that you went into these townships where the black citizens were living, all right? And all they did was they went into work at the beginning of the day and they came home from work, and there were no collective activities in the townships. There were no small businesses, there were no barber shops, there was nothing there other than kind of residential dorms, right? And so then it turns out that and they did that systematically to make sure that there was no room for a collective capacity to arise, right? Just systematically prevented any kind of collective capacity. The one thing they couldn't prevent from arising was religion, all right? So they gave permission for there to be churches there. And the other thing they couldn't suppress was drinking. Because people would create these informal bars, and they'd have people over the house, and they would all gather in these limits. And it turns out those were the places where the revolution was born, all right? In the churches and in the bars, all right? And then I realized that the same was true in America, that our revolution was born in the churches and the bars as well, right? So maybe the answer is to get the churches back and the bars back so we can have and it's not an accident, I don't think, that the idea of pubs are short for publicans and public houses, right? Because that's one of the places where a public forms, right? And just as one other quick side note on this, which I think is just fabulous, it turns out that we know what the social status hierarchy was in colonial America because Harvard kept records of the social class of the people it admitted, all right? So it turns out the highest social class was clergymen, all right, at that time. Do you know what the next highest class was? No. Professor
Pub owners.
Pardon me?
Pub owners.
Pub owners. It was publicans, all right, and they were called publicans, all right? And the reason they were called publicans was that they had this public responsibility, and their public responsibility was to make sure that the farmers didn't kill themselves when they went home. So they all had to have a bed upstairs for the guy to sleep in, and it was their duty to, and this survives, you see, in the licensing of tavern owners and the requirement that they serve food. So there's this public responsibility that we associate with drinking. So I think we've got to get back into civil drinking, I think is the way to solve the problem.
Mark, I'm going to try to assert some order to the discussion because I was hoping to also talk a little bit about your model, which we already did, by the way. But you, in your introduction earlier, you mentioned attacking new public management with your ideas.
Right.
Is that because this is a theme we struggled internally with each other about? Is it really attacking new public management, or is it rather improving new public management?
I don't care.
Oh, you don't care?
I'm a
We care. We care.
A dialectician, attack, prove, same thing, right? No, I think that the way in which I'm sorry, I don't mean to be that blunt. I think that
You're in Holland.
Yeah, exactly. And thank God for that. I think the thing that was the burr under my saddle, as they say, about the new public management was that it was following a microeconomic idea that said that the only appropriate arbiter of value in a society was an individual, all right? And that was true in guiding the economic activities of the society, because we gave people consumer sovereignty, and that meant that they could direct and guide the productive activities of large organizations by giving or withdrawing their customs. So, and the economists thought that the only appropriate arbiter of value was an individual. And on the political side, that they thought the only arbiter of public value was an individual voter, all right? But they weren't all that interested in individual voters and didn't care very much about them as individual voters. And for reasons I've just given, I don't think that that it's, I think that, yes, it's true that we want individual citizens to have to say, but I keep thinking that the idea of an individual citizen having a correct say has to do with the degree to which that person has qualified their opinion by sort of thinking about the publicness of the choice that they're about to make, all right? Just one footnote to that. I learned, John Stuart Mill is the advocate for individualism in Western philosophy. And so what do you would expect his position to be on the secret ballot, for it or against it, if he's the advocate of individualism? Don't have a view? You would expect him to be for the secret ballot because the person wanted to make an independent choice would be insulated from the publicness of his act, right? He was actually against it, secret ballot, because he said, well, it's perfectly all right to advance your own interests in the marketplace, but when you're making a choice that affects everybody in the voting booth, it would be a mistake to go into the voting booth and vote your own self-interest. You ought to be prepared to have your opinion exposed and reviewed by your neighbors so that you could feel the pressure to take their interest into account as well, right? This is the champion of individualism, right? 1870, right? So, so voting, you could imagine we would like to have it. Can I do one little game to illustrate this idea? Sorry, I need some people to do this. Okay, so now I want you to be a victim of crime.
Right.
Okay? Okay. I want you to be a criminal. I don't know how big a cultural bridge that is. And this next one is going to be a very hard one. I want somebody to be a hard-nosed American taxpayer. Right?
Uh-oh.
I was thinking you might be a taxpayer. Right? I don't want any of this Dutch socialist bullshit. Right? I want a hard-nosed American taxpayer.
My money back.
That's it. Okay, keep thinking that way. Now, we have to decide together, right, what kind of police force we would like to have. Okay? Now, as a victim of crime, what kind of police force would you like to have?
A strong one and an understanding one.
Strong and understanding. You'd like people to pay attention to your case. You'd like them to catch the bad guy who did things to you.
Yeah, right.
You'd like to help you heal your wounds of this thing, right?
Yeah.
And if you, how often would you like to be informed about the access to your case? Or about the...
On every occasion where a significant fact is added.
You're doing much too Dutch. You have to think much more American.
Every day.
Hourly.
Yeah, what are we waiting for?
Right, exactly.
Okay, yeah, right.
Goddamn bureaucrats, what are they screwing around with?
Yeah. I got the point.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So we want a big, powerful, sympathetic, high service quality
Yeah.
police department.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as a criminal, what kind of police department do you want?
I want a police department that's on my payroll.
On your payroll, do you like it to be corrupt?
Yes.
Would you like it to be efficient or inefficient?
Efficient on my payroll.
On your payroll, which means inefficient with respect to its public purposes, which is
Yeah.
calling you to account, okay? Would you like to be large or small?
A large police force. Or
More people to pay off.
that's my army.
I think he's a drug dealer. He's got some experience with this. Sorry, is there anybody else that would like to be in drug? And if this corrupt police force happened to catch you, how would you like to be treated?
Like a king.
Like a king. Full respect for your rights and responsibilities, a certain amount of sympathetic judgment about how you might be brought to this case, poor state.
No.
Like that.
I just want to
This guy
disappear.
really is a criminal.
I just want to disappear, not that they kill me, but that I go out of the public
View
perception.
for a while, just disappear and be allowed to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're a very ruthless and
Yeah.
corrupting criminal, all right? Now, as a hard-nosed American taxpayer,
How are they going to pay for those conversations?
you hear that? I mean, God, he was spending money, he was
Yeah,
just
like
reaching into
crazy,
your pocket
yeah.
all the time, right? Now, so what kind of police department do you want? I'll give you a clue. It's a one-word answer.
I want a small and efficient one. Is that what?
Too Dutch.
Too Dutch, yeah.
Small was pretty close.
No.
None. Cheap is the answer.
Cheap.
You want a cheap police department. After all, we've all got guns. We're not sure why we need a police department.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Solve it yourself. Yeah.
Self-maintenance police, all right? Now, notice that what was interesting is that even you, trying to be a hard-nosed American taxpayer, uttered the word effective.
Effective. Oh yeah.
Now, what in the world, when you said effective, what in the world were you thinking of?
And they're gonna catch the criminals. It's,
Well, you thought that
for the
you might
police
actually
money.
end up as a victim. And if you ended up as a victim, you'd like to have somebody there.
Yeah.
All right, now, he was exaggerated in the rights he was demanding, but you still could imagine that you might end up as a victim.
Sure.
And if you were a victim, you'd like something that wasn't just cheap, but cheap and expensive enough to give you some kind of service that would be valuable to you, because you could imagine being in his position.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Now, could you imagine being in the criminal's position?
No, but
Well, let me make it easier for you. Instead of this really rotten criminal guy we have over here, imagine for a minute that he was a person wrongly accused of a crime. Now, could you have some sympathy for him, and what would you want if you were thinking like him?
Dutch or American now?
American.
American. I don't care.
No, that goes a little too far, even for me.
No, but
Dutch answer.
Dutch answer. Yeah, you want some basic level of
Protection of his
protection
rights.
of his rights.
Yeah.
Due process and stuff like that.
Protection of rights, maybe even a little sympathy and, understanding. You don't have to overdo it, but a little bit of, oh yeah, I'm sorry, your mother was a drug addict and blah, 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 right? All that sort of stuff. Okay, so now notice that these three people, if asked to decide on what kind of police department they would like, couldn't make an agreement.
No.
Right? They would all disagree on the size of the police department, the way it operated, blah, 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 a lot of different things like that, right? And so people observe this and they say, well, you see, it's true. I mean, the problem of democracy is that we can't agree on what constitutes public value. It's all a subjective opinion, right? Notice that this subjective opinion is associated with their particular position, all right, and with respect to the functioning of the police department, right? And what's interesting about it is, and so it's true that we couldn't build a police department that would satisfy all of them in these particular positions, all right? And so what do we do if our goal is to have a agreed upon idea about what a police department should be like and do, and we can't get the agreement? Well, the philosopher John Rawls saw an interesting solution to that problem, and he said, suppose that we described a just institution as one that each of us would agree to live with, not knowing what particular position in society we were going to occupy. They call that the veil of ignorance, right? So we're just going to draw the veil of ignorance across you and deny you the opportunity to know whether you're going to be a victim, a criminal, or a taxpayer. Now what kind of a police department would you like? And first question, I suppose, would be is, do you think your opinion would change if you were thinking about the question from that point of view? Now notice it takes a huge act of empathy, right, to make that judgment. How the hell am I supposed to know what it would feel like to be a criminal or a victim or a taxpayer, right? So you have to empathize a little bit, so that asks a lot of people. But if you did that, do you think your view about what you would like as a police department would change?
Yes, please.
I think it probably would. Do you think it would move closer together? Might get a little closer together. It might not completely coalesce. We might never get to an individually subjectively held view of a publicly valuable police department that spreads unanimously across the land, right? But we might get a little closer together and get a little bit closer agreement about what a just and good police department would be like. So one of the ways to think about this is that the challenge for us is to say if you're looking for a reliable guide to what constitutes public value, the best place to go would be to the disinterested citizen, right? And the interesting question then would be to try to imagine the conditions under which we could create that experience for more people so that we could get a more reliable judgment as to public value out of a population that we were supposed to lead. Just make one maybe last comment, or maybe have some other questions, but I hope not. You'll get it right. But one way to think about this is that one of the odd things about being a public manager is that you may end up having to be the last and most fervent defenders of democracy as a method of governing. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that if there isn't a high-quality democracy, the question of who and for what you're working for is completely up for grabs, right? If you can't rely on there being some sensible political process that aggregates citizens' views into what you ought to be doing with their freedom and with their money, all right? Where the hell can you stand? Right? Your jobs are then kind of empty and without content. So this ought to be an important question, it seems to me. And and thinking about what you could do to deal with what seems to me to be an emerging governance gap that opens up between the politicians who are running for office, right, with every issue, and the bureaucrats who are running for cover all the time these days, right? That opens up this huge gap in the governance capacity of a democratic society, and somebody's got to close that. So good luck.
We're not completely done yet. 3 last questions. All big questions.
I have to tell you, I'm to understand why the Dutch are famous as taskmasters in my brief visit here so far. But go ahead.
If there's, we've been a fan of your work for the last years.
Yes, thank you.
No worries. If there is one other public administration thinker that you'd recommend to us who's making new theories that are worthwhile for us to pursue now for the coming years, who would that be?
Oh, geez. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I would give you one answer to it, which is one of your fellow countrymen and colleagues that I've worked with, a fellow named Jorrit de Jong, is, I think, a very promising guy. And I think you should keep an eye on him and his work. There's another guy named Michael Barzilay, who's at the London School of Economics. And he wrote a wonderful phrase that captured an awful lot of what I was trying to get at. And he was a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School, and he was the kind of scholar who was very methodical and reflective and self-conscious about the basis on which he could say or claim certain things. Right? He's very careful in the way he tried to construct the methodological basis behind any assertion that he wanted to make. And and he applied that over and over again to thinking about the development of the field of public management. He was there when we were just getting started, and We work together a lot, stuff like that. And he's just now written a book whose title is almost worth the price of the book. And the title is called, let's see if I can remember it. It goes, Public Management as a Design-Oriented, Design-Oriented Professional Discipline. All right? And I think that that's, for those of us who want to bring a certain amount of intellectual weight and heft and reasonableness to the process of managing in the public sector, the idea that what we're all in this together to do is to fully develop a design-oriented professional discipline, right, of public management, right? And that's not a social science discipline, and it's not derived from, particularly from a social science discipline. It emerges from our practice itself, and then emerges because you have smart, reflective, experienced people trying to make sense of their experience and try to improve at it. And so then he's got a whole series of chapters in the book about what he thinks that means and where it was done well. So that might be a place to go.
Good. Only 2 to go. What will you be doing in the coming years? You have presidential candidates in the U.S. who are a lot older than you are.
Yeah. Yeah, run for president. Yeah, absolutely. That's me. Yeah. No, I think I'm trying to, endlessly trying to get these ideas clear enough so that they leap off the pages into people's heads without them having to work too hard at it. And I feel like I continue to fail at that, and I can't tell whether it's because the ideas are just too complicated, or I haven't written about them clearly enough, or I haven't illustrated them well enough and stuff like that. But it's basically to keep going to try to make this ideas accessible to a larger number of people. Speaking of which, we did do an online course on creating public value last year at the Kennedy School, and we're running it again this fall, starting in September, and I think there's some brochures around, so that if you want to take this course, it's an online course, and you get runs for 8 weeks, and there are exercises that you go through, and you hear me say the same things over and over again. So
sounds tempting.
Yeah, right. So you can do that, and so I think I'll keep working on that. There are a couple of fresh things that I'm working on, which is all of this stuff about how to use public administration and management to recreate a democratic political culture, and to all the methods of calling a public into existence are things that I'm working on right at the moment. But that's what I'll do. Got 6 grandkids. That's good.
Good. The last question, traditionally also in the TV program, I already warned you.
Yeah.
If there's any life advice that you want to give to the audience.
Yep. You ready for it? Choose interesting work and a good spouse.
Good. Thank you.